Canada's housing agency says Canada has the highest level of household debt in the G7. The Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation says this makes our economy vulnerable to a global crisis. Deputy Chief Economist Alad Abyorworth says in a new analysis that the country's household debt has been rising inexorably. He says high levels of debt do the most damage when a significantly negative economic event happens and leads to widespread job losses. Now, those make it difficult or impossible for many mortgage holders to service their debt. Well, joining us now to discuss Canada's high levels of household debt and what it all means is Dr. Moshe Lander, an economist and professor at Concordia University. Dr. Lander, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Hello.
So why is Canada's household debt so high compared to its G7 peers?
Well, part of it is that we're allowed to have so much debt, right? Banks at the end of the day are going to approve mortgages or lines of credit or whatever other debt that we're going to take on. And so, if the banks are willing to let us take on that much debt, then it's not surprising that we're going to have that much debt. If it's available, then you're going to use it.
So in what ways are other countries in the G7 managing household debt better than us?
I don't know if it's necessarily that they're managing it better. I mean, part of it too is cultural, right? That in Canada, we don't necessarily have a stigma attached to going bankrupt, right? In fact, sometimes bankruptcy is almost seen as like a badge of honor that when rich people talk about, I went bankrupt 3 times before I hit it big. We just kind of shrug and say, well, good for you. In other cultures, in other countries, going bankrupt is something to be ashamed of. And so maybe some of it is just cultural that we have a little bit more American in us than we might sometimes care to admit, and we take that as something that's not to be embarrassed by, and so we don't mind taking on so much debt and taking that risk that comes with it.
That's an interesting perspective, Dr. Lander. Now, what concerns does this raise if Canada were to face a global economic crisis?
So, I mean, I guess it depends on what you mean by crisis, right? I don't know that the world is heading for some sort of disaster. We are heading for a slowdown. I don't know that that would constitute a crisis, but when the economy slows, the issue is: are there job losses that come with it? In your lead-in, we were saying that if you lose your job, hey, it doesn't matter how much debt you have. That's going to be a difficult time to have to pay it back. So, I think that's really the issue that we're watching for right now: is there going to be an increase in unemployment with this global slowdown, and how will it affect Canada? If people find it difficult to service their debts, then yeah, you could find bankruptcies or people showing up at the bank saying, I don't know how to pay back.
Now, Mr. Allett of Yorworth, he highlighted a scenario in which a significant number of mortgage holders might be unable to service their debt. That sounds eerily similar to the 2008 financial crisis, Dr. Lander. So, are we heading in that direction at all?
Heading in that direction, sure, but there's a lot of off ramps between here and 2008, and so I don't know that we're going to end up at that final destination. The reality is that, yeah, interest rates have gone up, the economy is slowing, the labor market remains strong, which means that there's a record number of people that have jobs. So there's a lot of things that would still have to go wrong before we start to find that people are in a position where they can't service their debt and they start to default. Don't forget, too, that in this country, because most of the mortgages are held with a limited number of banks, it's very likely that those banks would look to try and restructure your mortgage and find a way to keep you in possession of your home rather than saying, hand things back. The other thing, too, of course, is that in the US, there's a little more ability to just show up at the bank's doorstep and drop the keys and say, your problem. You can't do that in Canada.
All right, Dr. Lander. Now, meanwhile, in the U.S., we are seeing officials desperately trying to raise the country's debt ceiling. Some saying that the likeliness of the U.S. defaulting before the June 1st deadline is quite high. So, how do you see this potentially impacting Canada and, in turn, household debt levels?
So I don't know that the US is heading for a default. They are probably heading for a shutdown of government, and that would not be good news. But there's a big difference again between shutting down the government for a month until they figure out how to raise the debt ceiling and actually going to a world of creditors and saying, you're not getting your money back. I don't think that the US is foolish enough to hit there. The reality is, though, that financial markets will probably panic on June 1st if there's no agreement to raise the debt ceiling. This could lop some points off of their GDP growth, especially if it's a protracted government shutdown. That's not going to do good things for Canada. But again, does it translate into an economic slowdown here, resulting in big time job losses? If it doesn't translate into job losses, then it's going to be pretty negligible on our economy.
Definitely something to watch for. All right, Dr. Lander, we are out of time, but thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Anytime.